All right, hello there, thrill seekers. This is Brad Warner, your number one source for all things Zen. Did you know there's a bar in Tokyo run by Buddhist monks? Is that even allowed? We're going to talk about that after 14 seconds of the intro to the song Six Pack by Black Flag. Here we go. Hi there, thrill seekers. Of course, that was Six Pack by Black Flag. I just learned it yesterday, so I hope I played it okay. And I want to talk to you about a question that I received via Twitter. I love hearing questions from you folks who watch these videos who tell me what you want to see, because I don't know what you want to hear about Buddhist-wise. And if you want to tell me what you want to see me talk about on this channel, or hear me talk about if you're listening to the audio version, you can write to me at bw@hardcorezen.info. That's bw@hardcorezen.info, and tell me what you want me to talk about. Here's somebody who told me what he wants me to talk about, and it is this. I believe you've touched on this before, but not in depth. Reconciling being a bartender with being a Buddhist, or doing any job that may not align with the precepts for money, while trying to develop spiritually and focus energy on your passions outside of the job. Okay, that's an interesting question. Now, the basis for this question, I am sure, comes from a couple of places. In the Pali Canon, the very earliest iteration of Buddhism that we know of, I think there's, actually I've heard that there's something that they're arguing may even be earlier than the Pali Canon, but the Pali Canon is the most widely accepted early Buddhist thing. And it is said that the Buddha forbid people, which people, I'm not sure, because the thing I found didn't really specify. I'm not sure if he's talking about monks. I'm guessing he's talking about lay people who want to follow the Buddhist path. He forbid them to work in trades that caused others harm, specifically naming occupations that involved the sale of weapons, living beings, the sale of living beings, meat, intoxicants, or poisons. So that's there. And then there's this other thing that we have to contend with when we talk about being a bartender and a Buddhist. And I covered it in my newest book, The Other Side of Nothing. And it's actually, I devoted a whole chapter to the vow to refrain from taking intoxicants. And here's probably the most like right down the middle version of the precept against taking intoxicants. It's from the Brahmajala Sutra. It says, "A disciple of the Buddha must not trade in alcoholic beverages or encourage others to do so. He should not create the causes, conditions, methods, or karma of selling any intoxicant whatsoever, for intoxicants are the causes and conditions of all kinds of offenses. As a Buddha's disciple, he ought to help sentient beings achieve clear wisdom. If instead he causes them to have upside-down, topsy-turvy thinking, he commits a major offense." So it's a major offense to sell liquor. The original precept, Nishijima Roshi used to like to point out, was probably against drinking liquor or taking any kind of intoxicant. There's people who try to fudge this and be like, well, marijuana and mushrooms are not intoxicants. Yeah, they are. So it covers all intoxicants. And Buddhism is pretty clear on the idea that you shouldn't use intoxicants. And here's where the caveat comes in. And here's where the bar in Tokyo run by Buddhists that I'm going to talk about in a minute comes in. As Buddhism traveled outside of India, this idea specifically of using alcohol became a little difficult, specifically when it came to colder areas like Tibet and parts of China, where people considered alcohol to be a necessary thing to ward off the cold. And this is probably where the precept changed from being a precept against using any kind of intoxicants to a precept against selling intoxicants. The Tibetans especially were kind of loose with some of the Indian precepts. The other one that they were a bit loose with was, well, pretty loose with compared to the Indians, was about vegetarianism. So the early Buddhists were vegetarians. The rule was that you should accept whatever was put in your begging bowl. So if somebody gave gave you meat, you were supposed to accept the meat and eat it, but generally speaking, they were supposed to be vegetarians. Also, when Buddhism traveled into Tibet, Tibet was a place with very high altitude, so it was difficult to grow crops there, still is, and so they depended on meat for their diet. And you can go find the Dalai Lama talking about how he eats meat and stuff like that. So these precepts became kind of loosened as Buddhism moved out of its original cradle of India. My own experience with this goes back a few years. I was running a little Buddhist group, a little Zen group in a place called Hill Street Center in Santa Monica, California. Santa Monica, California. I'm trying to do like the Californians from SNL. I'm sorry, I can't do it right. Anyway, so I was running this little Zen group, and a friend of mine who used to come to it often told me her friend was very interested in coming, but he was scared to. This had been going on for months. He really wanted to attend this Zen group, but he was scared because he worked as a sommelier. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. One of these wine guys, one of these guys who's like an expert in wine and serves the wine and does this whole thing. I think he worked at a I don't know if it was a bar exactly, some sort of a drinking establishment where they did this. And he was scared that if he came to my Buddhist group, my Zen group, that I'd call him out and be really mean to him because he was working as a sommelier and he was violating the Buddhist precepts. But, I'm not going to do that. I don't really concern myself with what sort of jobs people do. Nishijima Roshi, my teacher, didn't concern himself with it. I remember there were a few people in his group who, a lot of us were expats living in Japan, and one of the jobs a lot of expats get is working as bartenders in Tokyo because it's considered kind of cool to have a foreigner bartender. So there were a few people who did that job. I remember somebody did some kind of what the kids these days are calling sex work. She used to come. Nobody ever brought it up. Nobody ever talked about it. I don't think there's any real danger in most Zen groups that I know of a teacher sort of calling you out for this sort of thing. I wouldn't discuss it except in a private one-to-one kind of setting. I wouldn't even bring it up. So, and I told my friend this, and the guy ended up coming and being a regular at the Hill Street Center. There is a koan that relates to this, and it's in Master Dogen's Shinji Shobo Genzo. This is Nishijima Roshi's translation of it. It's a standard koan. It's one you can find. I'm not sure if it's in the Mumon Kon and the Hekigan Roku, the Blue Cliff record, or the Gateless Gate. Might be in there too, but it's definitely in Shinji Shobo Genzo, and I'd like to read it to you. It is in Shinji Shobo Genzo, the Nishijima version of it. It is Book 1, koan number 21. So, here we go. One day in the past, Master Banzan Hoshaku of the U district went to a shop in a town and noticed a customer who was buying pork. And as you heard, butchering or selling meat was also one of the forbidden professions in Buddhism. So it's along the same lines as somebody being a bartender in this case. The customer said to the butcher, "Please cut me one piece which is fresh." The butcher threw down his knife and, holding his hands in shashu, and shashu is this, it's sort of what we call prayer position in English, in case you're not watching and listening to the audio version, it's like hands folded in prayer. So he held his hands in shashu and said, "Sir, where is there any unfresh pork here? Where is there any pork in here that is not fresh?" The master, who was listening to this conversation, realized the truth on hearing these words. And Nishijima Roshi's commentary goes like this. In China, butchers were looked down upon because they lived by violating the Buddhist precept against killing. Shashu is a gesture in which both hands are placed in front of the chest, the right gripping the fist made by the left. Oh, sorry, I gave you the wrong thing. It's this. I'm not going to even try to explain this to the people listening on the audio version. The right gripping the hand, making a fist like this. Anyway, so he holds his hand in a very Buddhist-y position, right? That's the point. It indicates an attitude of respect and reverence. It is a common part of a monk's life in the temple. In the butcher's complete and sincere attitude towards his work, Master Banzan felt the sincerity of all things and phenomena. The butcher had made his work into his Buddhist practice. He stood in his Dharma position, his place in the universe, as naturally as a rock or a river. This is the Buddhist attitude toward work and toward daily life in general. Buddhism does not end when we step out of the zendo. Buddhist masters sometimes talk of the miracle of chopping wood and carrying water. This is the miracle of daily life. It is the discovery of Buddhism, of life itself, in each and every moment. So the point of the koan is, even though this butcher was doing this work which violated the precepts, he was doing it in the spirit of the precepts, and the master watching this must have felt something very strongly about this and had maybe an entire change of attitude towards work in general and towards specifically the work of butchers. Now, I wanted to mention to you the bar in Tokyo. I started seeing these videos about a year ago, which is too bad because about 2 years ago I was in Tokyo, and if I'd known about this, I would have gone and visited this bar. But I'll put one of the videos on screen for you to see. There is a bar in Tokyo right now. I actually checked yesterday to see if it was still running, because most of these videos I have of it are about 10 years old. But it is run by monks, and it is called, in English you'd call it Vows, V-O-W-Z, or Z if you're watching from Canada or Britain, or Australia, I guess, or anywhere outside the USA where they speak English. Anyway, but if you're a Japanese person and you saw that word V-O-W-Z or Z, you would probably go Bose if you saw that. They tend to pronounce that. And Bose is the term for a Buddhist monk. And so it's sort of a play on vows and a play on Bozu, which is the term for a Buddhist monk.
Gongs and chanting are part of Buddhism, but cocktail shakers and ice picks may not normally be linked to it as well. However, one priest in Tokyo is going against the grain. Yoshinobu Fujioka owns a bar in the city. There's no karaoke here, but sermons and readings come free of charge.
So, as you can see, at this bar, they serve plenty of booze, and they give the cocktails that they serve kind of funny Buddhist-y names. I think there's one called Pure Hell, and there's a few which are plays on enlightenment and stuff. And they also try to encourage the patrons to get interested in Buddhism. They do sermons, they chant, they do some Buddhist rituals and things there. And the idea behind it, as I understand it, is that Buddhism is, in Japan, no longer very cool. It's a kind of a funny thing. For Westerners, there's a kind of coolness attached to being able to say, look, I'm a Buddhist and I practice Buddhism. In Japan, it's just the opposite. It would be like saying, I'm a Presbyterian and I go to church every Sunday. It sounds really nerdy and not very cool. So my understanding is what these monks are doing is they're trying to kind of they're trying to find a way to bring the coolness back to Buddhism. I didn't do a hugely deep dive into this place and what people are saying about it, but I can't imagine there's been no criticism. I hate double negatives. I imagine there's been criticism. That's how we say it without the double negatives. Of these monks for running a bar, but the bar has been in business, if my calculations are correct, at least 20 years. So the criticism certainly hasn't stopped them, and it's probably not that loud of criticism, because Buddhists in Japan tend not to be hugely dogmatic about things like this. It's not sort of the way Christians can be in the US and stuff, really dogmatic about things and kind of pushy. So there's probably been some mild criticism, but probably not enough to make them want to stop doing what they do. And basically, I think what they are doing is they're probably influenced by the koan that I just told you about the butcher. They're trying to do the job of a bartender in a way that is in the spirit of Buddhism, even though it is technically violating the Buddhist precepts. Now, I said that if somebody came to one of my Buddhist things that I do, retreats or classes or whatever, I wouldn't call them out for being a bartender or anything. I probably wouldn't even know unless somebody really brought it up. And if they brought it up in a public setting, I think I would be kind of gentle and a little bit nice about it. If somebody asked me one-to-one, I'll tell you what I would say. And this is for the sake of doing this video. It's normally this wouldn't be something I would shout on off the rooftops, but let's pretend somebody's asking, because probably by watching this video you're curious about what Brad might think about this. My feeling is that all of the Buddhist precepts are there for practical reasons. So, sometimes religious rules are very mysterious. My favorite example of a mysterious religious rule would be like kosher or halal, the Jewish and the Muslim food restrictions, wherein it's just sort of God tells you that you shouldn't eat pork or shellfish, but why you shouldn't... Ziggy, hang on. That's just... Anyway, God tells you shouldn't eat pork or shellfish, but he doesn't really say why. In the case of the Buddhist precepts, they developed out of practical things. So when the Buddha first started his group of people who were trying to meditate together with him, he didn't have any rules. But as the group became bigger and as more diverse sort of people joined and people who didn't really understand the deal joined, rules started to develop specifically to address problems that had developed in the group. So one can imagine, although we don't really have complete records of this, that the reason for the precept against alcohol abuse or use it came from people arriving at the group drunk or whatever, or just having problems with it, and then this developed into a rule. So the reason that it is recommended, I would say recommended rather than making it a rule, not to engage in these kind of works is because there is a tendency to... Okay, let's face it, one of the reasons people drink alcohol or take any kind of intoxicants, and I'm including myself in times when I've done this too, is to kind of give yourself courage or whatever, liquid courage, as they say, to do things that you probably know better than to do. At bars there are always fights and things breaking out, and there's always emotions. I mean, maybe not every day at every bar, but there's emotions can run high and things can get weird. I remember there was a bar when I first moved to Japan. I was among a group of expat English teachers who liked to frequent a bar in the city of Takaoka called Totoya. I don't know if Totoya is still there, but it was actually very close to where I lived. It was like a 2-minute walk from where I lived. It was just across the street and up the stairs or something like that. And I used to go with them sometimes, and what I noticed about Totoya, it was run by a couple, and the couple who ran Totoya, who served the drinks, almost every time they were getting just as drunk as the customers. And I remember that the last time I ever went to Totoya, and I'm not a drinker, I tried to indulge with this group of people because that's what you did over there, but I hated it, so I stopped. But what the thing that really pushed me over the edge was one night at the end of the night at Totoya, they gave me my bill and it was wrong. It was horribly wrong, and they were saying I drank way more than I did because I only had one drink, and in order to avoid an argument, I just paid up and I never went there again because the people who were figuring out the bill were drunk, so they didn't know who was who anymore, and they gave me somebody else's bill. So it's a setting where you're kind of going to be encouraged to be a little bit loose with your ethics. Whether that goes on to something really terrible or not is a whole other question. It probably won't in most cases, but you're gonna have that tendency. And that's why the rule is there in the first place. So if somebody were to ask me my advice on this, I would say, yeah, you can do that job, but if you're gonna do that job, be really careful. It's the kind of job where you're gonna have to be extra careful, more so than if you're working at the local water treatment plant, which happened to be the first job I ever had, or some other job where you're not likely to have your ethics compromised so often and so much. So it's probably advisable to either stay away from doing that kind of work or to be very, very careful about finding a way to do it in the most ethical way possible. And of course, there are people in those settings who do very ethical things, who do good things for the people they serve, cutting them off when they need to be cut off and so on, this kind of thing. So, it can be done, but it's kind of, you're kind of playing with fire. I don't know if that's really the metaphor I want, but you're kind of doing something where the likelihood of going wrong becomes increased. And that's why I think the rule exists. And it's not like a commandment from God, thou shalt not work in a bar. Okay, that's it. I gave my opinion. I hope my opinion wasn't too offensive. I'm just saying, if you're going to do that, be careful. That's what I would say to this guy who's asking the question, and what I'd say to you if you're asking that question too. If you want to donate to me not going to bars, but buying other things like dog food for Ziggy and everything else, you can go to the URL that you're going to see on the screen below, or that you're going to hear if you're listening to the audio version, and that is hardcorezen.info/donate. That is, again, hardcorezen.info/donate. That's how I make my living, is through your donations, and I really appreciate your support. But as always, you don't got to support me if you don't want to support me. All right, we will see you next time. Have a good time all the time. Remember your UFO types. Bye. Hey, Ziggy. What you think? You don't go to bars, do you? Doggies don't ever go to bars. You don't ever get intoxicated at all, do you? All right, Zig, have a good nap. Talk to you later. Bye.